Can you ask questions in Mandarin but struggle to understand the answers? Do you feel that you know the words but people just speak too fast? And why do words in Chinese sound so similar? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about one of my favorite topics, namely listening comprehension. It is at the same time the most important and most neglected area of learning Chinese. Students and teachers tend to focus on speaking ability, but being able to say something is not terribly interesting if you don't understand what other people say. If you ask a question and don't understand the answer, there is little use in being able to ask that question. And if you don't understand what people are saying, you don't know when it's suitable or appropriate to insert what you want to say and contribute to the conversation. Understanding what other people say allows you to navigate conversations and thereby build connections with other people. You can also learn about language and culture, and if you want to pass an exam, you probably need decent listening ability as well. If you use Chinese in the real world, for example for professional purposes, being able to understand what people say is of course crucial. However, the most important reason to improve your listening ability is that it can accelerate your learning in all areas. This is because listening is the most convenient way of downloading Chinese into your brain, but that requires you to understand what you're listening to. And so the more you listen, the more you will understand, and the more you understand, the more you will learn. Not just about listening, but about vocabulary, grammar, and much more. I created my course, The Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water, because I know that many people are neglecting listening comprehension. And this is not necessarily your fault. It's not easy to know what to do and where to invest the time. And even if you want to improve your listening ability, it's not obvious how you should go about it. For example, what should you listen to? Where do you find this listening? How difficult should it be? And how can you make sure you listen enough? These are some of the questions that we explore in this course, and I've just opened it for registration, and it will remain open until September the 7th. If you want to learn more about the course, you can check out episode 224, which I have linked to in the show notes. And if you're listening to this in the future after the course has closed, you can still head over to hackingchinese.com/courses and check out the availability of the listening course. In this week's episode, I don't want to focus too much on the course, but I do want to talk about listening comprehension in general. To do so, I thought it would be interesting to explore the quotes that I use in the introduction to episode 224, and if you haven't listened to that, I'll just list them here. I can ask questions, but when a native speaker replies, I'm completely lost. Even when I know the words, I still can't follow because they speak so fast. Listening to Mandarin feels like guessing, so many words sound the same. I understand my teacher, but anyone else might as well be speaking Martian. I know I need to listen more, but with so much to do, I keep putting it off. These quotes are based on what students have told me in surveys, emails, comments, and so on over the years, and I think they capture the frustration that many students feel when it comes to listening comprehension in Mandarin. Let's talk about each of these quotes and see if we can learn something useful. First up, we have, I can ask questions, but when a native speaker replies, I'm completely lost. This situation is extremely common, and I dare say that everybody has experienced this at least once, probably more than once in most cases. There are several reasons for this, and it's not necessarily because you've been neglecting listening ability in favor of speaking ability, but also due to other factors. For example, when you speak yourself, you can select words you know. By definition, you can only speak using words you know, so you will choose those. But when other people speak, they choose the words, and they might choose words you don't know. And which words you know is indeed not part of the criteria that they use for determining which words to use. Another reason you might struggle to understand answers is because the answers are just generally more complex than the question. If you want to know how to get from A to B, there are only a few ways of asking this in Chinese, but there is an infinite number of answers depending on where you are and where you want to go. So what I'm saying here is that understanding the answer to a question is complicated both because, native speakers can use a wide range of words and they can also give a wide range of answers. However, I also think that the way most people approach learning Mandarin makes it much more difficult than it needs to be. For example, if you learn Chinese in a fairly traditional manner, you might focus a lot on scripted dialogues, reading things in your textbook, doing exercises there, and so on. And this won't really prepare you for using this language in the real world. So even if people use the same words, the same grammar, etc., you might still not be able to communicate because you have been practicing something else. This is mainly about the difference between meaning-focused learning, so that's when we put the emphasis on what is said, what are we trying to express, and form-focused learning, when we talk about how things look, what they sound like, what is the correct grammar form here, what should the character look like, and so on. Most institutional language learning puts a very heavy emphasis on form-focused learning, and this means that when you get to the real world, where nobody really cares about this and only care about meaning, you will find it hard. There's a very simple way of checking if an activity is meaning-focused or not. Just see if there is some kind of information gap. If you're trying to tell your classmates something and they already know the answer, maybe because you know them in advance or because it says so in the textbook, this is not meaning-focused. On the other hand, if you are genuinely trying to communicate something to another person in Chinese, that would be meaning-focused. So you are trying to tell them something they didn't know, for example. This also encourages you to hone conversational strategies. For example, when you don't understand what somebody says, what's your next step? Do you feel despair and go home and feel bad about yourself? Or do you just ask the person to repeat themselves or speak more slowly or something else that will help you understand what they say? The thing is that if the way you normally practice Mandarin is very distant from the way it's actually used in real life, you will struggle to transfer the things you have learned in class or on your own to real-world conversations. So make sure you focus more on meaning. And if you want an entire podcast episode about that, you can check out episode 189. Let's move on to quote number 2, which is, "Even when I know the words, I still can't follow because they speak so fast." This is also a challenge all learners face, and it's not that native speakers of Chinese speak particularly fast, it's just that we perceive it that way. And I know that's not very helpful, so let's look at what's going on here. This is a good example of where just knowing things isn't enough when learning a language. It's also about how well you know it, how quickly you can retrieve that information, and how much effort it takes. Let's make this more concrete by looking at an example. So if it takes you 5 seconds to connect the sound 火车站 with the meaning train station, that means essentially that the native speaker, if they speak at a decent rate, will have said a dozen or more words in the time it took you to recall that one. And while you were busy trying to figure out what 火车站 means, the native speaker will have continued into the next sentence. And it doesn't need to be that extreme, even if it just takes you 1 second to recall what a word means, but there are many such words in a sentence, you will fall behind the speaker rather quickly. This means that you can know all the words and all the grammar and still don't understand what somebody says because you haven't been listening enough and you haven't heard these words in different contexts over and over. If you had, recall would be faster and you would be able to keep up. And when you encounter a word you don't know, you have the capacity to focus on it and try to figure out what it means, because you're not busy processing all these other words. So what I'm saying is that automating your listening is extremely important, and the only way to do that is to do meaning-focused listening and do a lot of it. For more about this, you can check out episode 123. Moving on to the next quote. "Listening to Mandarin feels like guessing. So many words sound the same." As before, there are several reasons you might feel like this, and part of it is because the language really does contain fewer sounds than, say, English, and part of it is that it's new to you, or because you haven't learned, for example, to distinguish tones, some words that would be different actually sound similar or even the same. So let's untangle this and see what you can do about it as a student. Naturally, there's not much you can do about the structure of Mandarin, which syllables exist and so on, but it still helps to be aware of the fact that there really are very few syllables in Mandarin. We are talking about some 400, and if we include tones, so variations on the same syllable but with different tones, we get to about 1,000 or a little bit more than that. That might sound like a lot, but a language like English probably has about 10 times as many. And a good indication of this is that when you study Mandarin, you build a feel for which syllables exist and which don't. So when you have been learning for a while, you will have seen most of the syllables you will ever see. And occasionally you will stumble upon a word that is just, oh wow, I have never seen this syllable, how quaint. But when you study a language like, say, English or French, you will never even think about syllables in that manner. There simply are too many of them, and the idea that you would have seen all of them is just a little bit strange. We don't think about it like that. In Chinese, though, as an intermediate student, you will have seen all the unique syllables you will ever see. So because there are fewer sounds, words will also sound more similar. Like I said earlier, there's not much you can do about this. This is just the way Mandarin is structured, but there are of course some things that can help immensely. I already mentioned tones, so if we ignore them, there are only some 400 syllables, which is much less than more than 1,000, and so things will sound even more similar. This effect is not limited to tones. If you mix up certain initials, say zhi, zhi, shi, or something like that, you will also in practice have fewer syllables, which will make things sound even more similar. So focusing on pronunciation and listening can help, but only to a point. Now, you might wonder, since there are so few syllables, don't native speakers also think that words sound similar? Well, in practice, this is not an issue, because Mandarin words rarely contain only one syllable. Instead, a vast majority of words have two syllables, and there are many words that have 3, 4, or even more syllables as well. This means that even if there are 100 characters with the pronunciation shi, this doesn't really mean that listening comprehension is harder, because these are not used alone. And even when they are used as single-syllable words, they are still used in context, where it's clear which one is which. That of course requires you to understand enough of the context to be able to rely on it to figure out what people are saying, but this is again why we are focusing on listening comprehension in the first place. If you want to know more about why listening in Chinese is hard, check out episode 195. The next quote is, "I understand my teacher, but everyone else might as well be speaking Martian." Depending on the angle you regard this question, it can either be something good or something bad. On the one hand, it's great that you understand your teacher, but on the other hand, it's not so great that you don't understand anybody else. As we've seen before, there are some things here you can do something about, and some things you really can't. The main reason it's easier to understand your teacher is because teachers are really good at talking with students. They have loads of experience doing so, they know exactly what you know and what you don't know, and so they can adapt what they say to make sure that you understand. This is related to what I said when we talked about the first quote, that other people can't really be expected to know what you know, but your teacher actually does know what you know. When you leave the classroom and talk with strangers, though, they don't, and so they will use Chinese that is harder, uses different words, or just isn't adapted to you as a student. There is nothing wrong with this, but it can feel disappointing and frustrating. There is no quick fix here, you just need to listen more and learn more over time, and you will be able to understand what other people say. There are some other factors to mention here, and one of them is familiarity with the person speaking. So if you've listened to your teacher, you know their voice, you know their accent, and so on, and this obviously makes it easier to understand things that they say. When you talk to a stranger, they have a different voice, they pronounce things slightly differently, and so on, and this makes it hard to understand at first. It's as if you add a filter on top of everything, and before you can penetrate that filter, it will be hard to understand. The good news here is that this gets easier the more people you've spoken to. So the first person you learn to understand is hard, of course, because you have to learn Chinese to understand anything. But the second person is not as hard. I mean, you know lots of words and so on, but this person still speaks in a different manner, so you need to adapt a little bit. And this will be difficult. But the third person then will be slightly easier, and the fourth and the fifth. And when you listen to hundreds of people, listening to a new person really isn't a challenge anymore. Now we've reached the fifth and final quote. "I know I need to listen more, but with so much to do, I keep putting it off." As we have seen, the remedy in most cases to almost any issue you might have with listening ability is simply to listen more. I mean, that instruction is very simple, but it's hard to put into practice. Most people can't just program themselves to listen to Chinese 2 hours a day for a year, and therefore we need other strategies. For example, it's essential to build good habits that allow you to listen more and to mix listening with other things you're doing, perhaps while you're out walking, when you're cooking or doing other chores, or maybe on your commute or something else. Building these habits allow you to listen a lot without investing a lot of energy, even if the habits themselves can require energy to build up. The good news here, I think, is that listening is mostly a matter of practice. It's not that each individual step is very difficult, it's that there are so many steps to take. So if you can figure out ways of listening that work well with your life and that you enjoy, and you start listening more, you will start reaping benefits very soon, and your listening ability will improve over time. I think that's enough listening comprehension for one episode, but if you want much more guidance for how to improve your listening ability in Mandarin, check out the Fluent Listener, Navigating Spoken Mandarin Like a Fish in Water. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.